Welcome and thank you for joining today's conference, Community Project Funding Grants webinar series. Before we begin, please ensure that you have opened the Q&A panel and the chat panel by using the associated icons on the bottom right corner of your screen. These can be found using the three dots right next to the chat feature. Please note that all audio connections are muted. You may ask content-related questions throughout the presentation by opening the Q&A panel and submitting your question there. Your question will be addressed at a later time. You may view closed captioning by clicking on the CC icon located on the lower left of the webinar window. If you require technical assistance, you may open the chat panel and send a chat to the event producer. And with that, I'll turn the conference over to Ben Sturm with Cloudburst. Please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you all again for joining the first of this three-part webinar series on the environmental review requirements for the CPF program. My name is Ben Sturm, and I am with the Cloudburst Group. Joining me today is my colleague and fellow Cloudburster, Harrison Martin O'Brien. Also joining us is Omri Gross with HUD's Office of Environment and Energy. Next slide. Throughout today's session, we'll be discussing the roles and responsibilities of conducting a HUD environmental review, talk through the details of the project description and aggregation, go through the steps of determining the level of review, and finally, provide an introduction to HUD's Environmental Review Online System, or HEROS, and how it is to be used for your CPF projects. Okay, next slide. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some brief housekeeping items. This session will be 75 minutes long with time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. During the presentation, please submit questions through the Q&A feature on WebEx. If your questions are not addressed today, we encourage you to submit your question through the HUD Exchange Ask a Question help desk for the CPF program. We will provide more detail on how you can submit AAQs towards the end of the session. As previously noted, this presentation is being recorded and all materials, including the slides and transcript, will be available within the coming weeks of this session. They will also be uploaded to the HUD Exchange following the completion of all three webinars. I'd now like to turn this over to Omri Gross to discuss the roles and responsibilities of the environmental review.
All right, thank you, Ben. Okay, my name is Omri Gross. I am the Program Environmental Clearance Officer for HUD's Community Planning and Development Funding Programs, which includes the Community Project Funding Program, the CPF program. We wanted to start this series off by providing an overview of the roles and responsibilities associated with the environmental review process for CPF grants. So let's jump right into it. Next slide, please. Okay, first off, CPF is a Part 58 funding program by default. We'll touch on the differences between Part 58 and Part 50 later in the presentation, but for now, Part 58 means that the environmental review will normally be completed by a local government responsible entity. A few important things to know about HUD environmental review. A HUD environmental review is required for all HUD-assisted projects. The environmental review ensures that the project or the proposed project does not negatively impact the surrounding environment and that the project will not have an adverse environmental or health effect on end users. Environmental reviews for CPF projects should be completed using HUD's Environmental Review Online System, also called HEROS, which we'll discuss more later in the presentation. A local government responsible entity will complete and take responsibility for the environmental review process and content. Responsible entities can be states or units of general local government that the project is located in and that have some level of land use responsibility. You can find more information about Part 58 procedures and requirements in the regulation and on our HUD environmental review landing page. Next slide, please. Okay, now let's review the various roles and responsibilities involved in the environmental review process for CPF grants. We'll talk about roles and responsibilities for grantees and recipients, responsible entities, partners, HUD's Office of Environment and Energy staff, HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development staff, and HUD's Congressional Grants Division staff. Next slide, please. As the CPF grantee and recipient of funds, you are responsible for reaching out to your local government responsible entity to request that they conduct the environmental review under Part 58. If the responsible entity refuses, if the local government refuses to conduct the environmental review, reach out to your environmental officer for the next steps. As grantees, you are also responsible for providing any project information requested by your responsible entity or your environmental officer, and provide any requested project information to your grant officer to move forward with the grant agreement. You are also, as grantees, responsible for providing a copy of the completed environmental review's signature page or the HUD-issued authority to use grant funds to your grant officer to indicate that you have met all your environmental compliance requirements. As the grantee, you are also responsible for carrying out any mitigation measures if required and prescribed by the environmental review for the project. Next slide, please. Okay, next up is the responsible entity. So the responsible entity is a unit of general local government in which the project is located in, and that has some level of land use responsibility. Responsible entities can be states, local governments, Indian tribes, Alaskan Native villages, or the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, but only when they are also the recipient under the program. The responsible entity for CPF grants conducts the environmental review for CPF grantees, including any necessary consultations and identifying any necessary mitigation measures. The responsible entity also, when required, prepares and publishes public notices, submits the request for release of funds and certification to HUD, and receives the authorization to use grant funds from HUD and shares that with the grantee. We'll discuss more about the public notice, request for release of funds, and authorization to use grant funds process in the coming slides. Next slide, please. Okay, next up is partners. Partners are any third party that is assisting the grantee and responsible entity with preparing or gathering information for the environmental review. Partners are often environmental consultants hired by the grantee or responsible entity staff, and their responsibilities may include preparing the content of the environmental review and preparing the content of any required public notices. However, partners are not allowed to make any final environmental determinations or initiate any required consultation. That has to be the responsible entity or HUD. Also, one other note here is that using CPF funds to pay for an environmental consultant to assist with the environmental review is an eligible cost. So keep that in mind. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, next on our list are HUD's regional and field environmental officers out of the Office of Environment and Energy, OEE. OEE provides environmental guidance, assistance, and training to HUD staff and grantees regarding their environmental review requirements. For CPF, OEE staff provides technical assistance to grantees and responsible entities with their compliance requirements under Part 58. And in rare cases, OEE staff also conduct environmental reviews for CPF grantees under Part 50. And that's when a grantee is unable to secure a local government responsible entity to conduct the environmental review under Part 58. Again, we'll talk more about this and Part 50 in the slides to come. Next slide, please. Okay, next up is HUD's Community Planning and Development staff. Although grantees work with the Congressional Grants Division, CGD, on various items such as executing the grant agreement, CPF is technically under the CPD, the Community Planning and Development umbrella. And when applicable, CPD's responsibilities include receiving the request for release of funds and certification from the responsible entity. And we actually have a nice handy link here for the request for release of funds points of contact. So again, if your project rises to a certain level of review, which we'll discuss more later on, it may require the public notice, request for release of funds, and authorization to use grant funds process, at which point you would reach out to the point of contact, the RROF, request for release of funds point of contact, to submit the request for release of funds. And so when environmental reviews require a request for release of funds, CPD receives that request for release of funds form, processes it, and holds a public objection period. Now, as mentioned, this process is not required for all projects, and we'll talk more about the different levels of review and what's required for them later on. HUD CPD is also responsible for issuing the authorization to use grant funds, which would be signed by the CPD director. And again, this is not required for all reviews or projects. So we'll get into when it's required and when it's not. But these are the roles that the community planning and development staff play, right? When applicable. They receive the request for release of funds, they process it, and they issue the authorization to use grant funds. Next slide, please. Okay, and finally, as far as our roles, we have the Congressional Grants Division, which is the HUD department that administers and manages the CPF program. Congressional Grants Division grant officers are responsible for collecting project information from the grantee, executing grant agreements, collecting and tracking the environmental review signature page or the authorization to use grant funds when necessary. And either the environmental review signature page or the authorization to use grant funds must be received prior to approving grantee requests for payment. The Congressional Grants Division grant officers are also involved in determining whether projects include soft cost activities covered by HUD's nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs only, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And grant officers also work with grantees to repurpose CPF funds when necessary. Next slide, please. Okay, so to recap the environmental review process under Part 58, the grantee reaches out and provides all necessary information to their local government responsible entity to complete the environmental review for the project. Then the local government responsible entity conducts the environmental review, and if the project requires a certain level of review, the responsible entity will need to also publish public notice, allow for the appropriate comment period to pass, and then submit a request for release of funds to HUD. HUD will then wait the 15-day objection period and issue the authorization to use grant funds after that. The grantee provides a copy of either the environmental review signature page or the authorization to use grant funds when necessary to their Congressional Grants Division grant officer upon receipt to indicate that their environmental review process has been completed. The grantee can then proceed with the project, but must also implement any mitigation prescribed by the environmental review. Now, one note to point out here is that if a CPF grant is awarded to a CPD entitlement community, that CPD entitlement community must serve as the responsible entity for their own CPF projects. Now, a CPD entitlement community is a local government that has been selected by HUD to receive an annual formula allocation of CPD funding. And this is CPD funding from other programs like CDBG and HOME. Now, these CPD entitlement entities are required to serve as a responsible entity for CPF projects that they are the recipient for. Next slide, please. Okay, now under Part 50, so we just talked about the process under Part 58. Under Part 50, which only comes into play when the grantee cannot secure a local government responsible entity, grantees would reach out to their environmental officer to request that HUD conduct the environmental review under Part 50 and provide all necessary and requested project information. Grantees may hire consultants to assist with gathering and providing all the necessary information. The HUD environmental officer then completes the review, conducts any necessary consultations, and certifies and approves the environmental review. The HUD environmental officer will provide a copy of the completed environmental review record to the CGD grant officer, who will provide a copy to the grantee. The grantee may then proceed with the project, but must also implement and monitor any mitigation necessary. Note that there is no public notice, request for release of funds, or authorization to use grant funds process under Part 50, as HUD is already providing approval by certifying the environmental review. And while this may seem like it would take less time under Part 50, keep in mind that HUD has limited capacity to take on additional Part 50 environmental reviews, so this is not something we want to heavily rely on, and we should be doing everything we can to encourage that environmental reviews for the community project funding for CPF remain under Part 58, where the local government responsible entity can complete the review. So yeah, just a word of caution, if the review does have to, if you can't find a responsible entity under Part 58 and you have to contact HUD to see if they can complete the review under Part 50, like I said, we have limited capacity to do so, and we're seeing large increases in requests like this, so there could be delays as well. So it benefits everyone involved if we can keep the projects under Part 58, where the local government serves as the responsible entity and conducts the environmental review. Next slide, please. Okay, now that we've discussed the various roles and responsibilities involved in the environmental review process, let's talk about what activities must be aggregated and covered by the environmental review and how to develop an accurate project description. Next slide, please. Here's a graphic that breaks down the environmental review process. First, the preparer defines the project, which is what we'll be focusing on in this section. Then, once the project is defined to include all aggregated activities, a determination is made regarding the appropriate level of review based on the nature and scope of the activities involved. After determining the level of review, the environmental review is actually performed, finalized, and if necessary, HUD approval is obtained prior to moving forward with the project and implementing any required mitigation. HUD has an online environmental review system called HEROS, the HUD Environmental Review Online System, that maintains records of the environmental review automatically and indefinitely. CPF projects are generally required to use HEROS to complete their environmental review unless certain extenuating circumstances apply. Now, let's dive into the project description and aggregation in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. The project description is one of the most essential components of an environmental review, as compliance requirements are determined based on the nature and scope of activities involved in the aggregated project, which is what we refer to as the level of review. The project description is intended to capture the maximum anticipated scope of the proposal, which includes all contemplated actions that are a composite part of the project. Project description should cover the specific activities of the project. So for example, quote, this project will upgrade the HVAC systems and weatherize the windows for single family units. That's pretty specific compared to, the project, quote, the project will modernize single family units, right? The first quote talks about specifically the HVAC, upgrading the HVAC systems, weatherizing the windows. But the second quote, right, the second description just says that, the project will modernize single family units, right, which is much more vague. So we always want to err on the side of providing more details, more specific details about what's actually happening in the project. Now, HUD's aggregation principles under 24 CFR Part 58.32 require that all related, reasonably foreseeable activities must be aggregated and included in the project description of the environmental review. Next slide, please. The purpose of project aggregation is to group together related activities so that the responsible entity can adequately address and analyze in a single environmental review the separate and combined impacts of activities that are similar, connected or depend on each other's completion. This allows the responsible entity to better consider reasonable alternative courses of action, schedule the activities to resolve conflicts or mitigate effects, and prescribe appropriate mitigation measures and safeguards. Under 24 CFR 58.32, a responsible entity must group together and evaluate as a single project all individual activities which are related either on a geographical or functional basis or are logical parts of a composite of contemplated actions. So what do these terms mean? Geographical, functional, logical. So a functional relationship is when a specific type of activity, so for instance, let's just take home repair, is to take place in several separate locations or jurisdictions. So same activity, so functional relationship is when you have the same activity in different locations, right? You have a home repair program, right? Same activity, home repair, but a bunch of different locations. That's a functional relationship, right? All of those different individual home repair units activities are related because they're part of the same home repair program, right? They have a functional relationship because the activities are the same, but they span different locations. A geographic relationship is when a mix of dissimilar activities is to be concentrated in a fairly specific project area. So for instance, if you have a demolition of a structure and construction of a parking lot to serve a larger new development project, right? So the actual project, the HUD assisted project could be this larger new development, right? But we also have to, there's demolition that has to occur on the site to remove structures. There has to be a construction of a parking lot to serve this larger new development. The demolition and the construction of the parking lot are related activities. They're geographically related by the same site. So geographic relationship is when you have the same location, but different activities. So functional relationship is when you have the same activities in different locations. Geographic relationship is the inverse, when you have the same location that has multiple different activities on it. So again, all of those things are need to be aggregated into the environmental review for the project at large. And then finally, a logical relationship is when activities are dependent on the inclusion and completion of other related activities. So for instance, if certain street improvements don't happen, we can't build the new HUD assisted development, right? So we can't do B without doing A, right? It's a logical relationship there, right? They depend on each other. Okay, and activities that are related in any one of these or a combination of these ways must be aggregated into the project review. Next slide, please. So here are just a few more examples of each type of potential aggregation. So starting with functional aggregation, right? This is, again, remember, the same activity in multiple different locations. So this could be like a single family rehab program, right? Where you're doing single family rehab for multiple different single family homes in different areas, or, any real scattered site projects would be considered kind of functionally related, where you're doing the same activity across multiple scattered sites. And then as far as geographic aggregation, remember, this is the different activities, but on the same site or same location. And so this could be like new construction plus infrastructure, right? So if new construction was the HUD assisted activity, but it required, but there was also some associated infrastructure that needed to happen, right? That's all on the same site, right? So different activities, same site. Same thing with acquisition and conversion of a property to a new use, right? If you're converting a property to a new use and that's what the HUD funds are going towards, right? You may still need to acquire that property. And again, the acquisition is happening, it's the same site, different activities must be aggregated into the environmental review. And then finally, logical aggregation. So remember, this is, we can't do B without doing A. So this could be like a demolition of a structure that's necessary to move forward with a HUD assisted new construction project, right? So there's a structure already there. The HUD assisted project, the proposed project is just a new construction, right? But the structure needs to be removed before you can move forward, right? So we can't do the HUD assisted new construction project without demolishing the old structure. So there's a logical relationship there. And just a note here, aggregation is essential for avoiding choice limiting actions. Next slide, please. So what are choice limiting actions? Now, the second webinar in this series will go into much more detail on the prohibition on choice limiting actions and the federal nexus, but we wanted to touch on it very quickly here as well for frame of reference. The prohibition on choice limiting actions at 24 CFR 58.22 states that following the federal nexus, neither the grantee nor partners in the process may commit or spend HUD or non-HUD funds on physical or choice limiting actions until the environmental review process is completed. So what are choice limiting actions? Some examples of choice limiting actions are acquisition, entering into any contracts, commitments, or agreements, spending funds, or any actions that limit the choice of reasonable alternatives to the project site or activities. So any action that is limiting the choice of reasonable alternatives to the project site or activities is considered a choice limiting action and cannot be taken after the federal nexus until the environmental review is complete. The federal nexus is the point at which the project becomes federalized, triggering HUD's environmental compliance requirements. For fiscal year 22 CPF grants, the federal nexus was the date of receipt of the letter of invitation, which was between July 18th to July 20th, 2022, depending on when you received that letter of invitation. For fiscal year 23 CPF grantees, the federal nexus was the date of enactment, legislative enactment, which was on December 29th, 2022. Now, after the federal nexus, the grantee and their partners are not allowed to commit or spend HUD or non-HUD funds on physical or choice limiting actions until an environmental review is complete. It's important to remember to communicate with your stakeholders early in the process to reduce the time necessary to complete the environmental review and to avoid taking choice limiting actions. Now, one caveat here that's important is that any work under existing contracts that were entered into prior to the federal nexus may actually proceed, but would be doing so at the project's own risk. So again, let me just repeat that. Caveat here is that any work under existing contracts that were entered into prior to the federal nexus may actually proceed, but would be doing so at the project's own risk. And that's because if the environmental review ends up identifying unmitigatable environmental harm resulting from the work performed under existing contracts, the project will not be able to use HUD funds and will need to reach out to their Congressional Grants Division grant officer to discuss potential repurposing of funds. We will discuss this in much greater detail during the second webinar, but it's just important to point out at all stages, really. Next slide, please. Okay, and now I will hand it over to Ben to cover level of review.
Thank you, Omri. Now let's get into the different types of environmental reviews. Next slide, please. After defining your project description, the next step of the environmental review process is to determine the level of review. The project description feeds directly into this determination because the level of review is determined by the types of activities involved in the project. There are 5 different levels of review, and the illustration here shows them from top being the lowest level of review to bottom being the highest level of review. We have exempt, categorically excluded, not subject to the laws and authorities under 58.5, or commonly referred to as CEST, categorically excluded and subject to 58.5, or CEST, environmental assessments, and the highest yet most uncommon level of review, environmental impact statements, EIS. The level of review mandates how in-depth your review is. So for example, if a bulldozer is being involved, that's generally going to mean a higher level of review. Whereas a project that's just planning, such as, just pushing paperwork or services, will usually be a lower level of review. For HUD environmental reviews, the environmental assessment, or EA, is the default level of review. In order to be reviewed at a lower level than an EA, the project must fall into a categorical exclusion or exemption in HUD's Part 50 or 58 regulations. Next to each level of review on this chart is the applicable compliance requirements associated with that level of review. As you can see here, all levels of review must meet compliance under the other requirements listed in 58.6. However, for CEST, EAs, and environmental impact statements, compliance must also be documented for the related laws and authorities under 58.5. Both environmental assessments and environmental impact statements will need additional NEPA analysis. Next slide. So let's briefly talk about these requirements, starting with 58.6. All projects, regardless of the level of reviews, are required to analyze the project for compliance with 58.6. This includes documenting compliance for flood and disaster protection, Coastal Barrier Resources Act, and airport and runway clear zone regulations. Projects that are not exempt or CENST must document compliance with 58.5. 58.5, also known as the fun stuff, is often referred to as the related laws and authorities. It includes complying with several laws and executive orders such as the Endangered Species Act, National Historic Preservation Act, and Executive Order 119900 on wetlands, just to name a few. Environmental assessments require additional analysis under NEPA, such as determining the cumulative impact the project has on the environment and vice versa, as well as evaluation of alternatives. Environmental assessment factors take into consideration land development, how the project fits into the community, site safety, community facilities and services, including infrastructure, natural features, and socioeconomic conditions. More detail on both the related laws and authorities and environmental assessments is provided on the HUD Exchange Environmental Review webpage. So let's move on to the different levels of review. Starting with the lowest of reviews, next slide, please. Starting with the lowest of reviews, activities that are categorized as exempt are listed at 24 CFR 5834A. The list of activities on this slide is not exhaustive. It's just to give an idea of the kinds of activities that are exempt. Projects that are exempt will generally have no physical effects, and as you can see here from this list, they are generally planning activities and services. Specifically for the CPF program, HUD completed a nationwide programmatic review that covers all planning, management, administrative, and maintenance activities. This programmatic review covers most exempt activities and allows grantees to incur reimbursable soft costs at any time after the date of enactment. However, grantees must first have a fully executed grant agreement and also must first reach out to their grant officer to confirm that the specific activity is eligible. If the grant officer confirms that the project is eligible under the programmatic review, then no further action would be needed. Next slide, please. The next lowest level of review is the categorically excluded, not subject to 58.5 or CENST. CENST activities are similar to exempt and would also be non-physical in nature. This list also consists of allowed services and financial activities. A couple things to pull out from this list, the first being tenant-based rental assistance, or TBRA. This is rental assistance that is attached to the renter, not the unit. Project-based rental assistance and or leasing, where the funding is attached to the property, is considered CEST, which is a higher level of review. Next, unlike repairs and improvements, maintenance activities do not materially add to the value of a building, appreciably prolong its life, or adapt it to new issues. Maintenance activities may include cleaning, measures to keep the building in working order, and replacement of appliances or objects that are not fixtures or part of the building. So to clarify, a, a fixture is an object that is physically attached to the building and cannot be removed without causing permanent damage, including electrical systems, plumbing, kitchen cabinets, and staircases. So if fixtures are replaced or any other activities that rise above the definition of maintenance are involved, that project cannot be CENST. The third CENST activity that I want to call your attention to is supplementary assistance, where additional funding is required for a project that has already been reviewed under Part 58 by the same responsible entity. That review is CENST under 5835B7. Just like the exempt level of review, most CENST activities are covered under the nationwide programmatic review for the CPF program. However, you still need to receive confirmation from your grant officer as to whether that activity is covered. Next slide, please. The next level of review is categorically excluded subject to 58.5 or CEST. In contrast to exempt and CENST projects, activities that fall under CEST will usually have physical impacts. They are also more specifically defined by the regulations at 24 CFR 5835A. The first categorical exclusion applies to acquisition and leasing of existing buildings, vacant land, and public facilities. These activities are CEST as long as there is no change in land use. For example, from a non-residential to residential use, commercial to industrial use, or one industrial use to another. This also excludes disposition of vacant land or existing buildings. Again, as long as there is no change in land use. For public facilities like water or sewer lines, sidewalks, and streets, there is no exclusion for disposition. Therefore, that would require an environmental assessment. ADA improvements such as the removal of material and architectural barriers that restrict mobility and accessibility to elder and handicapped persons are also considered CEST. Now, categorical exclusions can get extremely technical when you start looking at rehabilitation, repair, and improvement activities. Public facilities and non-residential buildings are CEST unless rehab activities lead to a change in land use or a change in size or capacity greater than 20%. CEST rehab activities with a change in size or capacity less than 20% would include replacement of water or sewer lines, reconstruction of curbs and sidewalks, and repaving of streets. Multifamily residential buildings are categorized using the same restrictions as above in that they are CEST as long as there is no change in land use and any change in size or capacity is less than 20%. But these projects have the added condition that in order to be categorized as CEST, the cost of rehab must be less than 75% of the cost of replacement after rehab. So for that analysis, you need to compare the cost of the rehab project to the appraised market value of the property. Rehabilitation of single-family residential properties, as defined for purposes of level of review, has projects touching a maximum of 4 housing units, has the same condition against changes in land use, and 2 new ones. First, density on site must not increase beyond 4 units, and second, the footprint of the building may not be increased in a floodplain or a wetland. So needless to say, it is very important to read through the Part 58 regulations. Another tricky section of what Part 58 regulations covers are called individual actions. HUD's regulations contain categorical exclusions for these activities only for single-family residential projects, by which we mean projects with 4 or fewer units per site. These can be 4 one-unit buildings, 1 4-unit building, or any combination in between. Section 5835A4 allows for CEST individual actions to be defined as new construction, demolition, reconstruction, which is just combination of the other two, in 2 situations. First situation, if any combination of these activities are performed on up to 4 dwelling units on the site. And the second situation, if those activities are performed on 5 or more housing units when the sites are more than 2,000 feet apart and there are not more than 4 units on any one site. After analysis with the related laws and authorities, CEST reviews can either be converted to exempt if no formal compliance requirements or mitigation measures are triggered, or if the review cannot be converted to exempt, then the responsible entity must proceed with issuing public notices, submit the HUD Form 701515, also known as the request for release of funds to HUD, and then wait for HUD to issue the authority to use grant funds in order to complete the environmental review. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's move on to the next level of review, which is the environmental assessment, or EA. Again, this is the default level of review, so if no categorical exclusion applies and the project isn't required to do an environmental impact statement, it is EA by default. Generally, these activities would be new construction, reconstruction, demolition, major rehabilitation, or anything involving a change in land use. Environmental assessments require an additional set of components for analysis on top of the related laws and authorities, including environmental assessment factors and the NEPA analysis. Environmental assessments cannot be converted to exempt. Upon completion of analysis, the responsible entity would make a finding of either significant or no significant impact. Finding of no significant impact is also known as a FONSI. This would also require a public notice process, submission of the request for release of funds, and the authority to use grant funds from HUD. Next slide, please. Finally, the highest level environmental review is the Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS. EISs are required for major federal actions having significant impact on the human environment. These are generally very, very large actions beyond the scope of a typical HUD project. Or after completing an EA, you determine that the project will have a significant impact. HUD regulations also state in 24 CFR 5837 that EISs are always required for projects that in any way affect 2,500 or more units or beds. In this case, an example, this would be hospitals. Or additionally, these may include large-scale infrastructure projects such as major highways or freeways. Environmental impact statements are a very small part of what HUD does, but HUD grantees do complete a handful of EISs each year, so it's important to be aware of the possibility. The Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, has guidelines on this process, so refer to their regulations for format and requirements. Also, be sure to reach out to your regional environmental officer if you believe that your project does require or might trigger an environmental impact statement. They would help walk you through the guidelines and the process that you may have to take if it is determined that an EIS will be required. So that pretty much wraps it up for the levels of review. I'd now like to turn this back over to Harrison to discuss the public notices.
All right, thanks so much, Ben. The public notice process is required in order to allow the responsible entity an opportunity to inform the public of any conditions that were identified during the review and to inform the public on your intent to submit a request for release of funds to HUD. The public notice process is carried out by the responsible entity, often with the grantee's assistance. As we discussed in the level of review slides, sometimes the circumstances of an environmental review will require the publication of one or more types of public notices. In addition to notifying the public about your intent to request a release of funds from HUD, public notices are also required in circumstances where an environmental condition was identified during the review and the responsible entity has to inform the public and provide an opportunity for the public to weigh in on the findings. The notice of FONSI is a notice of finding of no significant impact for a project. The FONSI comment period is 15 days when the notice is published in a local newspaper or 18 days when mailed and posted. The NOI RROF is a notice of intent to request a release of funds. The NOI RROF comment period is 7 days when the notice is published in a local newspaper or 10 days when mailed and posted. In some instances, both notices will be required, in which case the combined notice will have a public comment period of 15 days when published or 18 days when mailed and posted. Next slide, please. After the initial public comment period has elapsed, the request for release of funds is submitted to HUD via HEROS or via regular mail. If the review was completed in HEROS, you will assign the review to the CPF point of contact assigned for your state. Your HUD contact for CPF request for release of funds can be found at the link provided in the slide. Once submitted to HUD, the 15-day objection period begins. This provides HUD with time to review the submission and for the public to provide any additional objections or comments. After the comment period is over, HUD will approve the request for release of funds by issuing the authority to use grant funds, AUGF. Once this is received, work on the project can proceed or begin. It's also important to note that the request for release of funds may be disapproved if any of the following conditions apply. If HUD has knowledge that the responsible entity did not properly conduct the environmental review, if HUD finds inaccuracies in the request for release of funds, or if HUD receives valid public objections attesting to the inaccuracy or noncompliance of the environmental review. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've touched on it a couple times, but now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into HEROS here. So again, HEROS stands for HUD's Environmental Review Online System and is required for all CPF environmental reviews. HEROS is used for developing, documenting, and managing environmental reviews. Responsible entities are required to use HEROS to conduct reviews for CPF grants as well. HEROS covers all the levels of review that we just talked about with Ben for both Part 58 and Part 50 projects and includes on-screen guidance for completing your reviews. I also just want to note for all of you, if you're new to using HEROS, if this is the first time you're interacting with it, it's a really great way to streamline the environmental review process. The electronic templates in the system kind of walk you through all of the steps of the process based on your level of review. They cover all of the laws and authorities in great depth, and it really helps save you time in the environmental review process and provides guidance for how to complete each section. And most helpful to me, HEROS streamlines the submission of the request for release of funds as well as the public comment process. So definitely use HEROS, and we recommend you use a lot of the resources that we have available to take a look at. Next slide, please. Since HEROS is required for all CPF grantees, you will need to obtain access. In order to use HEROS, you'll have to complete the access form. Please note that if you already have HEROS access, you do not need to complete a new access form for CPF. Under step 1, your user type will depend on the entity that you work for. If you're working for a local government, you will register as a responsible entity. If you work for a nonprofit organization, you will need to sign up for partner access. We also recommend that you review the HEROS Access Form instructional video provided in Step 2. The video is around 10 minutes long, but covers all of the information that you will need to complete the access form. And then finally, you'll get to Step 3, where you complete the HEROS Access Form. On this slide, Step 3 includes a direct link to the form in case you need to access that. Once submitted, it will take around 2 to 3 weeks for your request to be processed. Once your account has been created, you will receive a HEROS welcome letter via email with your account information and instructions for logging in. One other thing to note here, you should make sure you keep the PIN that you create for HEROS somewhere accessible. In the event that you need to reset your HEROS password, you'll need to know what that PIN number is. Next slide, please. And finally, for HEROS, this slide has a list of resources that may be useful if you're new to HEROS or you're in need of some additional assistance. We have a link to the overall user guide, which covers all of the ins and outs of the HEROS system. We have a link to how-to videos. These basically give you a quick overview of various functions in the HEROS system. There's a link to archived reviews, which will take you to environmental reviews that were completed in HEROS and are available for public consumption. And finally, we have a link to the roles and responsibilities section of the HUD Exchange website for HEROS that provides a list of user types and roles in the HEROS system. And now I'll hand it back over to Omri to cover a few additional items.
All right, thank you very much, Harrison. Next slide, please. Okay. This slide contains links to key guidance and resources for CPF and environmental review, which can also all be found on the CPF landing page. So you can find it here. We're going to be sending out the slides. These are all links, but all of this is also on the CPF landing pages. Now, just to go through a few of these here. So starting with the top left, the CPF Environmental Review Guidance and Scenarios is the most inclusive CPF Environmental Review Guidance document and serves as a one-stop shop resource for general CPF Environmental Review guidance. Next, the guidance for documenting the environmental review record for CPF grants is an FAQ style resource that lays out procedures for coordination between all parties as it pertains to approval, completion, and documentation of the environmental review process. Next, the CPF cost eligibility charts are logic trees that are designed to assist in quickly and easily determining which project costs are eligible for payment. Now, there are some slight differences between fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23. That's why some of these resources have their own fiscal year 22 or 23 link. So depending on, which cohort your grant is in, just make sure that you use that appropriate resource for that fiscal year. There are also links to HUD's Part 50 nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs, where you can see exactly which soft cost activities are covered in the project description. There are links to the HUD's environmental review landing page, links to contacts for CPF grant officers, OEE environmental officers, and CPD request for release of funds points of contact. There's a link to HUD's Ask a Question help desk for CPF, and a link to a sample memorandum of agreement between a nonprofit grantee and a responsible entity that can be used to formalize each party's role in the environmental review process. Next slide, please. Okay, now since we have so many attendees on the call, we've decided to just go ahead and review some frequently asked questions, some questions that we commonly receive, that we've received through chat, that we've received through Ask a Question help desk, instead of doing a live question and answer, because it would just be very chaotic with this many attendees. And of course, if you have any other additional questions, or if your question is not answered here, please utilize our Ask a Question help desk, which we have links for throughout this presentation, as well as on the CPF landing page. Okay, so let's just go through these questions here. Again, these are very common questions that we receive, and I'll kind of go through some of the answers. So the first question is, how will I know when the environmental review requirements for my project have been met? So this really all depends on kind of, the scope and nature of your project, but for most soft cost activities covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for CPF soft costs, environmental compliance was achieved by HUD's environmental review at the date of the legislative enactment for that fiscal year. So for fiscal year 22, the soft cost, the HUD's Part 50 programmatic nationwide soft cost review for CPF has an effective date of, again, these are both the dates of legislative enactment for each fiscal year. For fiscal year 22, that's March 15th, 2022. And for fiscal year 23, that's December 29th, 2022. And so for most soft cost activities that are covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs, those are the dates, the effective dates essentially, right? The dates of legislative enactment for each cohort. Now for projects only involving exempt and CENST activities not covered by HUD's nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs, compliance is achieved once the environmental review is complete and signed by the responsible entity or by HUD under Part 50. For projects involving any CEST, categorically excluded subject to, or EA, environmental assessment level activities, right? So if your project rises to one of those two levels of review, CEST or EA, under Part 58, right, where the local government is the responsible entity, environmental compliance is achieved once the environmental review has been completed, public notice has been issued, request for release of funds and certification has been submitted, and the authorization to use grant funds has been issued by HUD. So again, for any projects that rise to the level of CEST or EA levels of review, under Part 58, the environmental review has to be completed, public notice has to be issued, the request for release of funds has to be submitted to HUD, and the authorization to use grant funds has to be issued by HUD to the grantee before the environmental compliance requirements have been met. Now, for CEST and EA level activities under Part 50, where HUD is the one conducting the environmental review, which again is we only get into that if you've exhausted all possible responsible entities, local government responsible entities under Part 58. So again, for CEST and EA level reviews under Part 50, where HUD is conducting the environmental review, environmental compliance is achieved once the environmental review has been completed and approved by HUD. Now, in all of these cases that I just went through, the grantee is also responsible for carrying out any mitigation prescribed by the environmental review. So even though the environmental review compliance requirements, may be complete as far as the environmental review and the environmental review record, in all cases, the grantee, if there are any mitigation requirements, the grantee is also responsible for carrying out those mitigation. All right, the next question is, how long after the environmental review is complete will I be able to start work for my project? Now, once the environmental review is complete and signed or approved as necessary, and a copy of the environmental review signature page or the authorization to use grant funds if necessary has been provided to the grant officer, grantees can start work. But again, grantees must also ensure that any necessary mitigation is implemented as prescribed in the environmental review. So again, how long after the environmental review is complete will I be able to start my work for my project? Once the environmental review is complete, and a copy of the environmental review signature page or authorization to use grant funds if required. Once you get those and you provide those to your grant officer, grantees can start work. But again, just keep in mind that if there is any mitigation that's necessary, the grantee is responsible for that mitigation. All right, the next question is, how do I know if public notice, request for release of funds, and authorization to use grant fund requirements apply to my project? So again, this is based on whether or not the public notice process, which includes the request for release of funds and authorization to use grant funds, whether or not that applies to your project will be based on the level of review of your environmental review. So if your environmental review only includes exempt or CENST activities, right, those don't require public notice, request for release of funds, or authorization to use grant funds. And the project can move forward after the environmental review has been signed and a copy of the environmental review signature page is provided to the grant officer. So again, for exempt CENST activities, so for projects that only rise to the exempt or CENST level of review, they do not require the public notice, request for release of funds, and authorization to use grant funds. You just have to have the responsible entity complete the review and then the grantee will need to provide a copy of the environmental review signature page to their grant officer before proceeding. Now for CEST and EA level projects, right? So these are projects where there are any activities in the project, in the aggregated scope of the project that rise to the level of CEST or EA. Those activities, those projects do require the public notice, the request for release of funds, and the authorization to use grant funds. Now, if you have any additional questions about level of review or whether or not your project requires a public notice, request for release of funds, and authorization to use grant funds, please send those questions to the Ask a Question help desk for CPF grants or reach out to your environmental officer to provide those project-specific details and ask that question. Next question is, can we pay for the environmental review using CPF funds? So the answer here is yes. CPF grant funds can be used to pay the responsible entity to assume and carry out the environmental responsibilities under Part 58. So yes, CPF grant funds can be used to pay for the cost of completing an environmental review. CPF funds can also be used to pay for the cost of an environmental consultant if necessary. Okay, next question is, what if my local government refuses to act as responsible entity to complete the environmental review for my project? Now, we have seen this in some situations where the local government refuses to act as the responsible entity just because they may not want to take on that responsibility. They're not the recipient of funds, they're not carrying out the project. So, that's something that they may refuse to do. Now, if this happens, please reach out to your regional environmental officer to discuss next steps. It will likely be that the regional environmental officer will do everything that they can to coordinate with the potential responsible entity and the grantee to try to maintain the project under Part 58, having the local government conduct the environmental review. There are a lot of reasons why it should stay at the local level, just because they're much more familiar with their area. They're much more clued into and tapped into their community and community groups and whatnot. They're a better location, for public notice to come out of, all of the above, essentially. But again, if you run into the situation where the local government refuses to act as the responsible entity, please reach out to your regional environmental officer and they'll discuss next steps with you. The next question is, if we already have a completed environmental review for our project, do we need to do another review? So the answer to this will be project specific and on a case-by-case basis, depending on the timing, level of review, aggregated activity, quality and content of the environmental review, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really a kind of more of a case-by-case question here. So please reach out to your regional environmental officer with the project-specific details, and they will help you determine whether another environmental review is necessary and what the next steps are. The next question is, what am I required to do if funds are received for a project that is already underway? So if you've received funds for a project that's already underway or a grant for a project that's already underway, which we have seen a lot of, the best practice is to stop all physical work after the federal nexus until an environmental review is completed for the aggregated project. Now, that being said, there are certain soft costs that are covered by HUD's nationwide review for CPF soft costs that may proceed after the nexus without a project-specific environmental review. That's kind of the whole point of why we completed this nationwide Part 50 programmatic review for all CPF soft costs, is because we wanted to essentially expand the opportunity for grantees to incur soft costs after the federal nexus, but prior to completing a project-specific environmental review. So definitely check out we have a link to HUD's nationwide review for CPF soft costs. Check out the project description. It lists all of the covered soft costs. And so again, right, those soft costs that are covered by the nationwide review may proceed after the federal nexus without a project-specific environmental review. Now, if there is ongoing physical work for which commitments were entered into prior to the federal nexus, that work may proceed after the federal nexus, but it would be doing so at the project's own risk. So again, if there's ongoing physical work for which commitments and obligations were entered into prior to the federal nexus, right? So you have this obligation from even before the project was federalized. The work under that obligation, under that contract, may proceed, even though it's our best practice. The best practice is to stop all work. We can't actually require that the project stop all work because there's that contractual obligation that was entered into before the project was federalized. So that work may actually proceed, but again, this would be at the project's own risk. And this is because a satisfactory environmental review for the aggregated project is still required before repayment of hard costs can occur. And if a satisfactory environmental review cannot be completed, then the project cannot be funded as designed, and the grantee will need to reach out to their grant officer to discuss the possibility of repurposing the funds. So again, we're going to get way more into this in the next webinar, talking about choice limiting actions and federal nexus. But just to give you some frame of reference here. Okay, the next question that we have on here, I believe that's our last question, is I have a completed environmental review, but I do not have an executed grant agreement. Can I start using HUD funds? So covered soft costs, so again, soft costs covered by our programmatic nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs, can be incurred from the date of enactment, but can only be reimbursed after the grant agreement has been executed. Now, hard costs can be incurred or performed. Incurred and performed are essentially synonymous here. So hard costs can be incurred or performed after the federal nexus, but only for work under contracts that were entered into prior to the federal nexus. So let me repeat that. Hard costs can be incurred or performed after the federal nexus, but only for work under contracts that were entered into prior to the federal nexus, and can only be reimbursed after a satisfactory environmental review has been completed and the grant agreement has been executed. So again, hard costs can be incurred or performed after the federal nexus, but only for work under contracts that were entered into prior to the nexus. And they can only be reimbursed after a satisfactory environmental review has been completed and the grant agreement has been executed. And then all other commitments and hard costs not under existing pre-nexus obligations can only be incurred after a satisfactory environmental review has been completed and can only be reimbursed after the grant agreement has been executed. So this is a very nuanced topic, and we're going to, like I said, we're going to really dive into this topic in a lot more detail in the second webinar. So keep that in mind. But if you currently have any questions between now and then about this, about the federal nexus, about the choice limiting actions, about cost eligibility, please feel free to send those questions to the Ask a Question help desk, or if you have very project-specific questions, please feel free, environmental questions, please feel free to reach out to your regional environmental officer to provide those project-specific details as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, that wraps up the presentation portion of this webinar, so I'll hand it over to Ben's team to discuss our Ask a Question help desk and provide some details about our next session. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Omri. So, as we conclude, and it's been referenced several times already, but I would just again like to remind, but also encourage anyone for additional questions that were not covered by Omri through his frequently asked questions overview. Please submit them to the HUD Exchange Ask a Question help desk for CPF. This also includes any questions pertaining to HEROS too, getting access to HEROS, using HEROS. You can please submit. You could submit them to HUD. You can submit an AAQ for those type of questions as well. So the AAQ portal can be found on the HUD Exchange. That's hudexchange.info under the Program Support tab. After you So when you go to the program support tab, look for ask a question desk. Um, and then after you enter your contact information on page 2, under the My Question is Related to drop-down menu, please select the CPF Community Project Funding option. It would be helpful to also provide your CPF grant number in the question subject line or somewhere in the question description text box. Next slide. So a recording of today's presentation and materials will be sent out to all participants via email once they're made available. Materials will also be uploaded to the HUD Exchange following the completion of the remaining sessions. Materials will include a recording of today's session, transcript, and the PowerPoint slides, as well as additional documents such as Q&A responses to all questions submitted. As a reminder, Webinar 2, the Federal Nexus and Prohibition of Choice Limiting Actions, will be held May 3rd at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time. This session will define the federal nexus for fiscal year 2022 and 2023 CPF grants and describe what activities can and can't take place before the completion of the environmental review per HUD's choice limiting actions requirements under 24 CFR 5822. As a reminder, the third session, cost eligibility and documenting environmental review records for CPF grants and HEROS, will be held on May 17th, also at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time. If you had registered for today's session, then you are already enrolled in webinars 2 and 3. You will receive a reminder email the morning of each session with the webinar login instructions. So this concludes today's session. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session on May 3rd.
Thank you for joining today's call, and thank you for using Event Services. Your call has ended, and you may disconnect.